3 sisters stood before the Duke, but he chose the silent girl serving tea. The grand hall of the Ashford estate had never held such tension. 3 young women stood in a perfect line before Duke Cassian Ashford, each more radiant than the last. Their silk gowns caught the afternoon light streaming through the towering windows, casting rainbow patterns across the marble floor. Behind them, their father, Viscount Harrington, stood with his chest puffed out, a man certain he'd secured his family's future. But no one was watching the sisters. Every servant in that hall, myself included as I later learned, had their eyes on the girl who wasn't supposed to matter at all. The one pouring tea in the corner with hands that trembled ever so slightly, the one who'd been instructed to remain invisible. Her name was Ilara. Let me take you back to where this story truly begins, 3 weeks before that fateful afternoon, in the rain-soaked streets of the capital city. Duke Cassian Ashford had a reputation that preceded him like thunder before a storm. At 32 he'd never married, never courted, never showed the slightest interest in the parade of eligible ladies that society thrust before him. With black hair that fell just past his collar and eyes the colour of winter storms, he commanded respect without uttering a word. Some called him cold. Others said he was simply waiting for something, or someone, worth his time. What they didn't know was that the Duke carried a wound no title could heal. 2 years earlier, his younger sister had died in childbirth, abandoned by a husband who'd married her for connections rather than love. Cassian had held her hand as she slipped away, and her final words haunted him. "Don't let them turn marriage into a transaction, brother. Promise me." He'd promised, and he'd meant it. So when the Queen herself suggested, no, insisted, that it was time for the Duke to marry and produce an heir, Cassian found himself trapped between duty and the memory of his sister's dying wish. The Viscount Harrington saw his opportunity and seized it with both hands. He had 3 daughters, Cordelia, Beatrice and Genevieve. Each had been groomed since birth for exactly this moment. Cordelia, the eldest at 24, possessed a sharp intellect and sharper tongue. She could discuss politics, philosophy and military strategy with equal ease. Beatrice, 22, was the beauty, golden-haired and graceful, with a voice that could charm birds from trees. Genevieve, the youngest at 19, had a wild spirit and infectious laugh that could light up any room. They were, by any measure, perfect candidates. The Viscount secured an audience with the Duke, promising him not 1 option but 3. Surely one of his daughters would prove suitable. What the Viscount didn't mention was the 4th girl in his household. Ilara was 21, born to the Viscount's distant cousin who died in poverty. The Viscount had taken her in as an act of charity, or so he claimed publicly. In truth, he'd needed another servant, and taking in a destitute relation looked better than hiring one. For 6 years Ilara had lived in the Harrington house, not quite a servant, not remotely family. She slept in a small room near the kitchens, wore hand-me-downs from the sisters, and made herself useful in whatever way she was told. She arranged flowers, mended clothing, helped the cook, and most importantly, stayed out of sight when guests arrived. She'd learned to read by stealing books from the library late at night. She'd learned about kindness from the elderly gardener who snuck her extra food. And she'd learned about survival by making herself so quiet, so unremarkable, that the Viscount sometimes forgot she existed at all. That was exactly how she preferred it. The day Duke Ashford's acceptance letter arrived, the Harrington household exploded into chaos. "Girls," the Viscount bellowed, gathering his daughters in the parlour, "the Duke has agreed to receive you. This is our moment. One of you will become a duchess. I don't care which one, but failure is not an option." Cordelia straightened her spine. "I'll engage him intellectually. Men of power respect intelligence." "Men of power are still men," Beatrice countered, examining her reflection in a hand mirror. "Beauty has toppled kingdoms." Genevieve rolled her eyes. "You're both overthinking this. I'll simply make him laugh. Joy is irresistible." Their father nodded, satisfied. "Each of you has strengths, use them." In the corner, Ilara continued mending a tear in Cordelia's second-best gown, her needle moving in steady, practiced strokes. She'd learned long ago not to look up during these family moments. Invisibility was survival. but Cordelia noticed her anyway. "Ilara," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "you'll accompany us to serve tea. We need someone to make us look good by comparison." Beatrice laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Cordelia, that's cruel. She'll make us look good simply by standing there in that dreadful grey dress." "It builds character," their father added absently, already mentally spending his future son-in-law's money. Ilara said nothing. She simply nodded, kept sewing, and felt the familiar weight of insignificance settle over her shoulders like an old coat. What none of them knew, what they couldn't have known, was that Duke Cassian Ashford had no intention of choosing any of them. He'd already decided to reject the Viscount's offer entirely. The morning of the meeting, Cassian stood in his study, staring at a portrait of his sister. "Forgive me, Margaret," he whispered, "but I cannot marry where there's no possibility of love. I won't repeat the mistakes that killed you." His closest friend and adviser, Lord Thomas Brightwell, cleared his throat from the doorway. "The Queen won't be pleased." "The Queen has 4 other nephews who can secure bloodlines," Cassian replied. "Let her pressure them." "You're going through with the meeting, though." "I gave my word I'd receive them. I'll be courteous, offer tea, and politely decline. The Viscount can save face by telling society I'm impossible to please." It was a perfect plan. It would have worked beautifully, if not for the girl carrying the tea tray. The Harrington carriage arrived at Ashford Manor precisely at 2 o'clock. The 3 sisters descended like a vision of silk and perfume, each step calculated for maximum grace. The Viscount followed, already bowing though the Duke hadn't yet appeared. Ilara climbed down last, clutching a small bag containing spare handkerchiefs, smelling salts, and the other odds and ends the sisters might require. Her dress was indeed grey, a faded thing that had once belonged to a housemaid. Her dark brown hair was pulled back in a simple braid. She kept her eyes down and followed 3 steps behind. They were led to the great hall, a room that seemed designed to make visitors feel small. Portraits of Ashford ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge everyone who entered. A massive fireplace dominated one end, unlit in the late spring warmth. And then he entered. Duke Cassian Ashford moved like water, smooth, unhurried, and somehow inevitable. His black hair was tied back loosely, emphasizing the sharp planes of his face. He wore simple but immaculately tailored clothing in deep navy, without the excessive ruffles or embroidery that other nobles favored. Everything about him suggested power held carefully in check. "Viscount Harrington," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly through the space, "your daughters." The formal introductions began. Cordelia stepped forward with a curtsy that displayed both respect and confidence. Beatrice's greeting was accompanied by a smile that had reportedly made 3 different lords propose on the spot. Genevieve's curtsy was playful, ending with a small, charming stumble she'd clearly practiced. Cassian acknowledged each with the bare minimum of courtesy. He'd already composed his rejection speech in his head. But then his steward, Mr. Pemberton, gestured to a side door. "Your Grace, refreshments." "Yes, thank you." What happened next would change everything. Ilara had been instructed to wait in the service hallway until called. She stood there, back against the cold stone wall, listening to the muffled voices from the great hall. Cordelia was speaking now, something about agricultural reform. Ilara could picture her, standing tall and confident, saying all the right things. That's when she heard the crash from the kitchen. The head maid, Mrs. Cotsworth, appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "The tea service, it fell, shattered completely. We don't have another set prepared for guests and—" "I'll bring it," Ilara said quickly. "Just tell me when it's ready." 10 minutes later, she carried the hastily assembled replacement tray through the hallways of the great manor, her heart pounding. The tray was heavier than expected, loaded with a full tea service, small cakes and cups for 6 people. She'd never been more aware of her worn dress, her simple braid, her complete lack of preparation for being seen by anyone important. "Just set it down and leave," she told herself. "You've done this 1,000 times." But the great hall was larger than any room she'd ever served in. The ceiling soared overhead. Her footsteps on the marble floor sounded impossibly loud. and all those painted ancestors seemed to stare directly at her. She kept her eyes down and headed for the serving table. That's when Genevieve, in the middle of an animated story, gestured broadly. Her hand caught the edge of Ilara's tray. The world seemed to slow down. The tea service tilted. Ilara lunged to catch it, overcorrected, and felt her foot catch on the hem of her dress. She was going down, taking the entire tray with her, about to create a disaster that would humiliate the Viscount and probably cost her what little place she had in his household. Then a hand caught her elbow. Another steadied the tray. Ilara found herself looking up into eyes the colour of a winter storm, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. Duke Cassian Ashford had moved faster than seemed possible for a man his size. He'd crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, and now held both her and the tea service in a grip that was gentle but absolutely secure. "Steady," he said quietly, and the word seemed meant for more than just her balance. Their eyes met. Later, Cassian would try to explain what happened in that moment. He'd tell Thomas that it was like recognizing something he'd been searching for without knowing he was searching, like the final piece of a puzzle sliding into place, like coming home. But in that instant he simply thought, "Oh, there you are." Ilara felt the heat rush to her cheeks. "I'm so sorry, Your Grace, I—" "No harm done," he said, and his voice was different now, warmer, though perhaps we should set this down before we tempt fate twice. He helped her carry the tray to the table, an act so far beneath a duke's dignity that everyone in the room froze in shock. "Thank you," Ilara whispered, already backing toward the door. "Wait." She stopped, everyone stopped. Cassian was staring at her with an expression that made the Viscount's blood run cold. It was the look of a man who just discovered something valuable. "What's your name?" Ilara's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Ilara, Your Grace, I'm no one important." "I'll determine what's important," Cassian said, and something in his tone made it sound like a promise. "Pour the tea, please, and stay." The Viscount stepped forward quickly. "Your Grace, she's merely a servant, distant relation fallen on hard times. I took her in out of charity, she's not." "I asked her to stay," Cassian repeated, his eyes never leaving Ilara's face. "Do you object, Viscount?" No, of course not, Your Grace." Ilara's hands shook as she poured the tea, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Cordelia's gaze burned with confusion. Beatrice looked offended. Genevieve seemed merely curious. But it was the Duke's attention that made Ilara's heart race. He watched her hands as she poured, noting their grace despite the trembling, the careful precision of her movements, the way she served everyone else before even considering herself. When she offered him his cup, their fingers brushed. "Thank you, Ilara," he said, deliberate in his use of her name. She curtsied and retreated to the corner, trying to disappear. It was already too late. The rest of the tea service was a disaster, though only the Viscount truly realized it. Cordelia attempted to resume her conversation about politics, but the Duke's responses were distracted. Beatrice deployed her most dazzling smile and received a polite nod in return. Genevieve told her funniest story and got a slight upturn of lips that never reached his eyes. Because Cassian Ashford was watching the girl in the corner. She stood perfectly still, hands folded, eyes down, but he noticed things, the way her fingers tightened whenever the Viscount spoke harshly, the slight flinch when Beatrice snapped at her to refill the water pitcher, the carefully neutral expression that he recognized as a mask worn by someone who'd learned to hide. He recognized it because he'd worn the same mask himself, in the years after his parents died, and he'd inherited a title at age 19. When the tea was finished, the Viscount stood, radiating forced confidence. "Your Grace, I hope this has been a pleasant introduction. Perhaps we might discuss." "I'll call on you tomorrow," Cassian said abruptly, "at your residence." The Viscount's face lit up. "Wonderful, the girls will be delighted to receive you. We can arrange for private audiences with each." "I'll come at 10 o'clock, Cassian continued. "Please ensure everyone is present." He looked directly at Ilara as he said it. The carriage ride back to the Harrington estate was tense. Well, the Viscount said, breaking the silence. That was inconclusive, but he's calling tomorrow. One of you clearly made an impression. He barely looked at me, Cordelia said, her voice tight. He barely looked at any of us, Beatrice added. He looked at the clumsy servant, Genevieve observed. That was odd. All eyes turned to Ilara, who'd made herself as small as possible in the corner of the carriage. Don't be ridiculous, the Viscount snapped. The Duke was merely being kind to an unfortunate. It's what nobility does. Ilara, tomorrow you'll make yourself scarce. Stay in the kitchens. I won't have you embarrassing us again. Yes, sir, Ilara whispered. But that night, alone in her small room, she lay awake remembering the feeling of strong hands steadying her. The warmth in a voice that everyone said was cold. The way he'd looked at her like she was something precious rather than something to be ignored. She told herself she was being foolish. She told herself dukes didn't notice girls like her. She told herself to forget the whole thing. But her heart wasn't listening. Meanwhile, in Ashford Manor, Cassian stood at his study window, staring out at the darkness. You're going to call on them tomorrow? Thomas asked from his chair by the fire. Yes, because of the servant girl. Because of Ilara, Cassian corrected. You spoke with her for less than a minute. I know. Thomas studied his friend's face. Cassian, be reasonable, she's nobody. No dowry, no connections, no. She's someone who's been invisible her entire life and has somehow remained kind despite it, Cassian said quietly. Do you know how rare that is? Most people who suffer become cruel. She's learned to be gentle. You gathered all that from watching her pour tea. Cassian turned from the window. I gathered it from watching everyone else treat her like furniture and seeing that she still served them with grace. I gathered it from the way her hands trembled but didn't spill a drop. I gathered it from the fact that when she nearly fell, her first instinct was to save the tea service, not herself. He paused, remembering his sister's words. Margaret told me not to let marriage become a transaction. Those three sisters, they've been taught to see marriage as exactly that, a business arrangement, a transaction where they trade beauty or wit or charm for a title. And Ilara doesn't even think she's part of the equation, Cassian said, which means she's the only honest person in that family. Thomas stood, shaking his head with a slight smile. You're either about to do something brilliant or something catastrophically stupid. Probably both, Cassian agreed. The Queen will have your head. The Queen will adjust. And you're certain about this, after one meeting? Cassian thought about the moment their eyes had met, the recognition, the certainty. I'm certain I need to know more, he said finally, and I'm certain that girl has been overlooked for far too long. The next morning arrived with unseasonable cold, as if the weather itself sensed something momentous was coming. At the Harrington estate, the three sisters were primped and positioned in the drawing room by 9 o'clock. Cordelia wore deep blue that made her look regal. Beatrice was in rose pink that highlighted her complexion. Genevieve had chosen sunny yellow that matched her personality. Ilara was in the kitchens, helping prepare refreshments she wouldn't be allowed to serve. At precisely 10 o'clock, Duke Ashford's carriage arrived. But the man who entered the drawing room wasn't the controlled, distant figure from yesterday's tea. This version of the Duke had a purpose. Ladies, he said, acknowledging the sisters with a polite nod. Then his eyes swept the room. I was under the impression everyone would be present. The Viscount frowned. Your Grace, my daughters are all here. I meant everyone in the household, Cassian said calmly, including Ilara. The silence that followed was deafening. Cordelia broke the silence first, her voice carefully controlled despite the anger flashing in her eyes. Your Grace, surely you're not suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Cassian interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. I'm stating clearly that I'd like Ilara to be present. The Viscount's face had gone through several shades of red. Your Grace, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. Ilara is not, she's merely a ward, a charity case. She has no place in a formal courtship discussion. Then it's fortunate I'm the one who determines what's formal and what isn't, Cassian replied, settling into a chair with the kind of casual authority that came from never being questioned. Shall I have my driver fetch her, or will you? 5 minutes later, Ilara stood in the doorway of the drawing room, looking like a deer that had wandered into a wolf's den. She'd been elbow-deep in bread dough when the head maid had found her, frantically wiped her hands, and been shoved toward the stairs with no explanation. Now she stood in her kitchen dress, a brown thing with flour still dusting one sleeve, facing a room full of people staring at her like she'd grown a second head. "Come in, please," Cassian said gently, and the contrast between how he spoke to her versus how he'd addressed everyone else was stark enough to make Beatrice's jaw tighten. Ilara moved into the room with small, uncertain steps. "Sit," Cassian continued, gesturing to an empty chair near him. "Your Grace, she can stand," the Viscount interjected. "She's accustomed to—" "I'd prefer she sit," Cassian said, and though his voice remained level, there was steel beneath it. Ilara sat, perching on the edge of the chair like she might need to flee at any moment. What followed was the strangest hour the Harrington household had ever experienced. Duke Ashford proceeded to interview them, not just the 3 eligible daughters, all 4 young women. He asked about their interests, their daily routines, their thoughts on everything from literature to local politics. Cordelia answered every question with practiced brilliance, showcasing the education she'd received from the finest tutors. Beatrice transformed each response into an opportunity to display charm, her voice musical and her expressions perfectly calibrated. Genevieve was witty and engaging, making even the Viscount smile at her clever observations. And Ilara stammered through answers about her love of gardening, admitted she'd never travelled beyond the neighbouring county, and confessed that her favourite book was a tattered copy of poetry she'd found in the library. "Which poet?" Cassian asked, leaning forward. "I don't know, Your Grace," Ilara admitted, her cheeks flushing. "The title page was missing, but there's one poem about stars that I've read so many times I've memorized it." "Recite it." "Oh, I couldn't. Please." Something in his eyes made her brave. Ilara closed her eyes and began. "Though darkness falls and daylight flees, and I am small among the trees, the stars above will always know the secret paths where wild things go." Her voice was soft but clear, each word carefully pronounced as if the poem were something precious. Cassian watched her face as she recited, saw the way she relaxed into the familiar words, how her hands stopped trembling, how she became someone else for just a moment, someone who wasn't invisible. When she finished, the room was silent. "That's from Edmund Wraith's collected works," Cassian said quietly. "My sister loved that particular poem. She used to recite it when she was frightened." Ilara's eyes opened, meeting his. For a moment, something passed between them, a recognition of shared grief, of understanding what it meant to hold onto small, beautiful things in a harsh world. Beatrice's voice cut through the moment like a knife. "How lovely. Your Grace, might I offer you more tea?" The interview continued, but the dynamic had shifted. The 3 sisters could feel it. The Duke's attention kept returning to Ilara like a compass finding north. When Cordelia spoke about philosophy, he nodded politely. When Beatrice laughed, he smiled distantly. When Genevieve told a story, he listened with courtesy. But when Ilara answered his questions in her halting, honest way, he engaged. "What would you do if you could do anything?" he asked her at one point. The 3 sisters had given elaborate answers to this question. Cordelia wanted to establish a salon for intellectual discourse. Beatrice dreamed of hosting legendary social events. Genevieve wished to travel to Paris. Ilara bit her lip, thinking. "I'd like to have a garden," she said finally. "A real one, not just the kitchen plot. Somewhere I could grow things that are just beautiful, not useful. Roses and lavender and those blue flowers, delphiniums I think they're called. I'd spend whole afternoons there, reading and watching things grow." It was such a small dream, such a modest wish. And Cassian looked at her like she described something magnificent. That sounds perfect, he said. When the Duke finally took his leave, he addressed the Viscount with careful formality. Thank you for your hospitality. I'll be in touch shortly with my decision. Of course, Your Grace, the Viscount said, already calculating which daughter had the best chance. I'm certain any of my girls would make you an excellent Duchess. Cassian's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked to Ilara one last time. Indeed. The moment his carriage disappeared down the drive, hell broke loose in the Harrington household. What, Cordelia said, her voice dangerously quiet, was that? He was being kind to a less fortunate, the Viscount began. He asked her to recite poetry, Beatrice shrieked. He didn't ask me to recite anything, and I actually studied elocution. Maybe he's just eccentric, Genevieve offered, though she too looked troubled. Rich men have strange whims. All eyes turned to Ilara, who'd been trying to slip out of the room unnoticed. You, Cordelia said, standing. What did you do? Nothing, Ilara whispered. I don't understand any of this. You must have done something, Beatrice hissed. Said something, fluttered your eyelashes or… That's enough, the Viscount interrupted, though his own eyes on Ilara were suspicious. The Duke was simply being thorough. Tomorrow he'll make his choice and it will be one of you three. He pointed at his daughters. Ilara, you're to stay out of sight from now on. If he calls again, you're ill, understood? Yes, sir. But as Ilara fled to her room, her heart was pounding with something that felt dangerously like hope. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying the conversation, the way the Duke had looked at her, the gentleness in his voice. She told herself she was being ridiculous. Dukes didn't choose kitchen maids. Men like that didn't see girls like her. Except he had seen her, really seen her. She was still awake when pebbles started hitting her window. Ilara lived on the ground floor, her small window facing the kitchen garden. She'd left it cracked open to let in the cool night air. Now someone was definitely throwing stones at it. Heart pounding, she crept to the window and peered out. A figure stood in the shadows of the garden, tall, broad-shouldered, and completely out of place. Duke Cassian Ashford raised his hand in a small wave. Ilara's mind went blank. Then she panicked, looking around her tiny room as if the Duke might somehow be able to see inside. She was in her nightgown, a worn white thing that had been mended a dozen times. Her hair was loose down her back. This was completely inappropriate, utterly scandalous, and… Another pebble hit the window. She opened it fully, leaning out. Your Grace, she whispered urgently. What are you? You can't be here. I can be wherever I choose, he replied, his voice low but carrying clearly in the still night. Come down, please. I can't if anyone sees. There's no one to see, I checked. Just for a moment, Ilara, please. The use of her name, spoken in that voice, made her decision for her. She grabbed her shawl and slipped out through her window, a route she'd used many times when she wanted to read in the garden without being disturbed, but she'd never imagined using it to meet a duke in the middle of the night. Cassian stepped out of the shadows as she approached, and even in the moonlight she could see he'd changed from his formal day clothes into something simpler. He looked younger, more human. You shouldn't be here, she said again, clutching her shawl around herself. If the Viscount finds out… Let me worry about the Viscount, Cassian said. I needed to see you, to talk to you without an audience watching every word. Why? The question came out more plaintive than she'd intended. Cassian took a step closer, because every moment in that drawing room was a performance, everyone saying what they thought I wanted to hear, doing what they thought I expected, everyone except you. I didn't know what you wanted to hear, Ilara admitted. Exactly, he smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. You were just yourself. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Ilara shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. I came to ask you something, Cassian continued, and I need you to answer honestly, not what you think I want to hear, the truth. All right. Are you happy here? The question caught her completely off guard. Happy? No one had ever asked her that. Happiness wasn't something people in her position were supposed to consider. I'm grateful for what I have, she said carefully. That's not what I asked. Ilara looked down at her bare feet in the grass. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. No, I'm not happy, but I'm safe and I'm fed and I have a roof over my head. That's more than many people have. You deserve more than just survival, Cassian said fiercely. You deserve that garden you described, and books with all their pages, and a life where you're not invisible. I'm nobody, Ilara said, and the words came out broken. I'm the poor relation they took in out of pity. I have no dowry, no family, no prospects. Tomorrow you'll choose Cordelia or Beatrice or Genevieve and you'll forget I exist, and that's exactly how it should be. What if I don't want to forget you? She looked up at him then and found him closer than before, close enough that she could see the intensity in his eyes. What if, he continued, I told you that I came to that house looking for a suitable marriage and found something I'd stopped believing existed? Your Grace. Cassian, he corrected. My name is Cassian, and I know this is insane. I know we've only spoken twice. I know every rule of society says this is impossible. It is impossible, Ilara said, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. Why? Because you're a duke and I'm nothing. You're not nothing, Cassian said, and his hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle, asking permission. You're someone who's been treated as nothing for so long that you believe it. But I see you, Ilara. I see your kindness and your strength and the way you've survived cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. And I want. He stopped, seeming to catch himself. You want what? Ilara whispered. I want to know you, he said simply. Really know you, not in a drawing room with your jailers watching, not in stolen moments at midnight, though I admit this is rather romantic. Despite everything, Ilara felt herself smile. It is rather scandalous. Spectacularly so, he smiled back. If anyone knew I was here, your reputation would be ruined. I don't have a reputation to ruin. Then let's ruin mine instead, Cassian said, and there was a recklessness in his voice that was entirely at odds with his controlled public persona. Tomorrow I'm going to come to this house and make my choice, but I need to know, if I choose you, if I ask for your hand instead of one of your cousins, what would you say? Ilara's breath caught. You can't, the Viscount would never allow. The Viscount can't stop me from proposing to whomever I wish. You're of age, the choice would be yours. Cassian, she said, using his name for the first time, and watched his eyes darken at the sound of it. I don't understand why you would want this, want me. He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. My sister died because she married a man who saw her as a transaction, a means to an end. In her last moments she made me promise not to make the same mistake, not to let marriage become about titles and alliances instead of people. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and Ilara found herself leaning into the touch without meaning to. Those 3 women in there, he continued, they're not bad people, but they've been taught to perform, to present a version of themselves designed to catch a husband. When I talk to them, I have no idea who they really are beneath the performance. And me, Ilara asked. You haven't had the luxury of learning to perform, Cassian said. Everything about you is real. When you smile, it's genuine. When you answer my questions, you're actually thinking about the answers instead of calculating what I want to hear. And when you talk about wanting a garden, you're not trying to impress me, you're sharing a piece of your soul. Ilara felt tears prickling at her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this, like she mattered, like she was worth knowing. I'm frightened, she admitted. So am I, Cassian said. This is either the smartest or stupidest thing I've ever done, possibly both simultaneously. What if I disappoint you? What if I'm not? What if you realize I'm not? What if you stop deciding you're not good enough and let me decide what I want? The words were firm but kind, and they cut through all of Ilara's protests. I can't promise you perfect, Cassian said. I can't promise that this will be easy or that society won't have opinions, but I can promise you that garden, and a library full of complete books, and a life where you're seen and valued and never invisible again. You're offering me a fairy tale, Ilara whispered. I'm offering you a choice, Cassian corrected. Tomorrow, when I come to call, I'm going to ask the Viscount for permission to court you. He'll likely refuse, at which point I'll ask you directly. You can say no. You can choose to stay here to play it safe, or you can take a chance on something terrifying and wonderful. And if I say yes, then we'll figure out the rest together. They stood there in the moonlight, the impossibility of the moment stretching between them. Ilara knew she should be sensible, should say no, should protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak of reaching for something so far beyond her station. But when she looked into Cassian's eyes, she didn't see a duke. She saw a man who'd lost his sister and been lonely, a man who valued honesty over performance, a man who'd noticed her when everyone else looked through her. She saw someone who saw her. "Ask me tomorrow," she said finally, "and I'll answer." Cassian's smile was like sunrise. "That's all I needed to hear." He stepped back, releasing her, though she could see the reluctance in the movement. "I should go before I compromise you further." "I think we passed compromise about 10 minutes ago." He laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded. "You might be right. Sleep well, Ilara." "You too, Your Grace." "Cassian," he reminded her. "Cassian," she repeated, and watched his expression soften. He disappeared into the darkness, leaving Ilara standing in the garden with her heart racing and her entire world tilted on its axis. She didn't sleep at all that night. Neither did the Duke. Or, as it turned out, Cordelia, who'd been watching from her second-floor window and had seen everything. Morning arrived far too quickly. Ilara went through her usual routine in a daze, helping in the kitchen, tidying the rooms, staying invisible. But she felt fundamentally changed, like she was wearing a skin that no longer fit. Every time she looked at a clock, her heart hammered. He was coming, today, to ask for her. It still seemed impossible. The three sisters were dressed by 9, even though the Duke hadn't specified when he'd arrive. Cordelia wore deep emerald that made her look like a queen, but there was something sharp in her expression, something calculating that hadn't been there before. She'd spent the night making a decision of her own. At 11 o'clock, Duke Ashford's carriage pulled up to the Harrington estate for the 3rd time in as many days. The Viscount greeted him in the drawing room, his 3 daughters arranged like prizes on display. Ilara was conspicuously absent, hidden in the kitchens as ordered. "Your Grace," the Viscount began, unable to quite hide his eagerness, "we're honoured by your continued interest. I trust you've come to a decision regarding which of my daughters—" "I have," Cassian interrupted. His voice was formal, controlled, giving nothing away. "But first I'd like to speak with each young lady privately, 5 minutes each. It's only proper." The Viscount blinked. This wasn't standard protocol, but then again, nothing about this courtship had been standard. "Of course, Your Grace, whatever you prefer." Cassian spoke with Genevieve first. When they were alone, his demeanour was kind but clear. "You're delightful," he told her honestly. "Any man would be lucky to have your spirit in his life." Genevieve studied his face. She was young, but she wasn't stupid. "But not you." "But not me," he agreed. "You deserve someone who will match your energy, who will want to travel and dance and fill their home with laughter. I'm not that person." "It's the mousy one, isn't it?" Genevieve said, though there was no malice in it, just curiosity. "Ilara." Cassian didn't confirm or deny. "Thank you for your graciousness." When Genevieve emerged, she shrugged at her sisters. "Well, I'm out." He was very polite about it, at least. Beatrice went next, already knowing what was coming but determined to try anyway. "I could make you the envy of every man in the kingdom," she said, deploying every weapon in her considerable arsenal. "Our children would be beautiful. Our home would be the center of society. You'd never have cause to regret choosing me." "I don't doubt any of that," Cassian replied. "But would you be happy, Beatrice? Truly happy with a man who prefers quiet evenings to social events, who'd rather discuss books than attend balls?" Beatrice's perfect smile faltered. "I could learn to enjoy quiet." "You shouldn't have to learn to enjoy your own life," Cassian said gently. "You should have someone who celebrates who you are, not who asks you to dim yourself." When Beatrice left, her composure was cracking. He's rejecting all of us, she hissed to her father. This is humiliating. Finally Cordelia entered, and unlike her sisters she came armed. Before you give me the same speech you gave them, she said coolly, let me save us both time. I know about last night. Cassian's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Do you? I saw you in the garden with Ilara, a private meeting in the middle of the night. Very scandalous, Your Grace. She smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. One might even call it compromising. One might, Cassian agreed, his voice dangerously quiet. What's your point, Cordelia? My point is that you've clearly made your choice and it's incomprehensible. Ilara has nothing to offer you. No connections, no education, no family. She's a charity case who will embarrass you at every social function. Your concern is noted. But here's what I'm offering, Cordelia continued, leaning forward. Choose me instead, and I'll make sure no one ever hears about your midnight indiscretion. I'll ensure Ilara is comfortably settled somewhere far from court. Everyone wins. Except Ilara. Ilara will be fine. She survived this long, hasn't she? Cordelia's eyes were hard. What she can't survive is the scrutiny that would come from being your Duchess. The whispers, the mockery, the constant reminders that she doesn't belong. You'd be condemning her to a life of misery out of some misguided romantic notion. Cassian stood, and the movement was fluid and somehow threatening. Let me be very clear. Are you attempting to blackmail me? I'm offering you a rational alternative. You're threatening to ruin an innocent woman's reputation if I don't choose you instead. His voice was ice. That's not rational. That's cruelty disguised as pragmatism. Cordelia's composure cracked slightly. I would make you a perfect Duchess. I've been preparing for this my entire life. She can barely hold a conversation without stammering. She stammers because people like you have spent years making her feel worthless, Cassian said. And you're right, you would make a perfect Duchess. Perfect, polished, and completely without genuine feeling. My sister died married to a man exactly like that. He moved toward the door, then paused. Ilara can learn etiquette. She can learn to navigate society. But what you're missing, empathy, genuine kindness, the ability to see people as more than tools, those things can't be taught. Cordelia's face had gone pale with rage. If you choose her, I'll make sure everyone knows about your midnight meeting. Her reputation will be destroyed. Then destroy it, Cassian said flatly. But know that if you do, you'll make an enemy of me, and I promise you, Cordelia, you don't want that. He left her standing there, shaking with fury and something that might have been fear. In the drawing room, the Viscount looked up expectantly. Your Grace, have you made your decision? I have, but first I need Ilara to be present. Your Grace, I really must object. Viscount Harrington, Cassian said, and his voice carried the full weight of his title and authority, I am attempting to be courteous. Don't mistake courtesy for weakness. Bring Ilara here. Now. The Viscount scrambled to comply. 5 minutes later, Ilara entered the drawing room, still in her kitchen dress, flour on her hands from the bread she'd been kneading. She looked terrified. Cassian's expression softened the moment he saw her. Ilara, he said gently, I'm going to ask you something and I need you to answer honestly. Not what you think anyone else wants to hear, just the truth. She nodded, not trusting her voice. If you could choose any life for yourself with no limitations, what would it be? Ilara was aware of everyone staring at her, the Viscount, the three sisters, even the servants hovering in doorways. Her mouth was dry. This was the moment, the choice Cassian had promised her. She could play it safe, say something modest, deflect. Or she could be brave. I'd choose a life where I mattered, she said quietly, where I wasn't invisible, where I could grow things and read books and be seen as valuable. And if someone offered you that life, Cassian continued, his eyes never leaving hers, but it came with challenges, with people who'd judge you, with having to learn new things and face situations you've never experienced. I'd still choose it, Ilara said, stronger now, because I'd rather fail at something wonderful than succeed at being invisible. Cassian smiled, that real smile that transformed his whole face. Then he did something that made the entire room gasp. He dropped to one knee. "Ilara," he said, "I am not offering you a perfect life. I'm offering you a partnership. A chance to grow together, to learn together, to build something real. I'm offering you that garden and a library, and every day a reminder that you are seen and valued and precious." He pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple band with a single emerald that caught the light. "I'm asking you to marry me, not because you're convenient or because you fit some checklist, but because in 3 days you've shown me more genuine humanity than I've encountered in years. Will you take this terrifying chance with me?" The room was utterly silent. Ilara looked at the man kneeling before her, at the ring, at the life being offered. Then she looked at the Viscount's purple face, at Cordelia's barely suppressed rage, at Beatrice's shock, at Genevieve's wide-eyed surprise. She thought about the small room by the kitchen, the hand-me-down dresses, the years of being invisible. And she thought about gardens and books and being seen. "Yes," she whispered. Then louder, "Yes." Cassian stood and slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit like it had been made for her. Then, in front of everyone, he raised her flower-dusted hand to his lips and kissed it. "Thank you," he said softly, "just for her." The Viscount finally found his voice. "Your Grace, this is highly irregular. Ilara has no dowry, no." "I don't require a dowry," Cassian said, not looking away from Ilara. "I require only her consent, which she's given, unless you're planning to deny permission." No, of course not, Your Grace, this is so unexpected." "Life's most important moments usually are," Cassian replied. He finally turned to address the room. "The engagement will be announced immediately. The wedding will take place in 1 month. Ilara will move to Ashford Manor tomorrow to begin preparations." "Tomorrow," Ilara breathed. "Unless you'd prefer to stay here longer?" Cassian asked, and there was a challenge in his eyes. He knew exactly what her answer would be. "No," she said quickly, "tomorrow is perfect." Cordelia stepped forward, her face a mask of composure that didn't quite hide the fury beneath. "Your Grace, might I have a word in private, about what we discussed earlier?" "There's nothing more to discuss," Cassian said coldly. "And if you're considering sharing any rumors or gossip, I'd advise you to reconsider. I have a very long memory and considerable influence." The threat was clear. Cordelia paled but said nothing. That night, as Ilara packed her few belongings, a task that took less than an hour since she owned almost nothing, there was a knock at her door. It was Genevieve. "I came to say goodbye," the youngest sister said, lingering in the doorway, "and to say, I think you'll be good for him." Ilara looked up in surprise. "You're not angry?" "Angry, no, jealous, maybe a little, but mostly I'm impressed." Genevieve smiled. "You somehow got a duke to fall for you in 3 days while doing absolutely nothing to catch him. That's either magic or you're genuinely special. I suspect it's both." "I don't know how to be a duchess," Ilara admitted, the fear finally catching up with her. "Then you learned how to survive here, didn't you? And that was much harder." Genevieve crossed the room and impulsively hugged her. "Be happy, Ilara. Someone in this family should be." After she left, Ilara sat on her narrow bed, looking at the ring on her finger. It caught the candlelight, throwing tiny rainbows across the walls of the small room she'd occupied for 6 years. Tomorrow, everything would change. She was terrified. She couldn't wait. At Ashford Manor, Cassian stood in what would soon be Ilara's room, a suite of chambers that faced the gardens. He'd spent the evening making sure everything was perfect. Fresh flowers, new books on the shelves, and through the window a view of the space that would become her garden. "You're sure about this?" Thomas asked from the doorway. "More sure than I've been about anything." "The Queen is going to be furious." "The Queen will adjust," Cassian repeated, "and if she doesn't, she has 4 other nephews to manipulate." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Your sister would have liked her, Ilara." Cassian's smile was soft and sad. "Yes, she would have." "What if it doesn't work? What if the girl can't handle the pressure?" "Then I'll be there to help her." Cassian turned from the window. That's what partnership means, isn't it? We face the challenges together. But neither of them could have anticipated the challenge that was already being set in motion. Because Cordelia hadn't accepted defeat. Late that night, she sat at her writing desk, composing a letter. The recipient was Lady Marguerite Sheffield, the biggest gossip in court and a woman who'd been vying for the Duke's attention for years. Cordelia's pen scratched across the paper. "My dear Lady Sheffield, you'll be interested to know that Duke Ashford has become engaged to a most unexpected candidate, a penniless ward of questionable background who has been living in our household in a servant's capacity. The Duke was observed meeting with her privately at midnight in our garden, unchaperoned. One can only wonder what compromising situation led to such a hasty proposal." She sealed the letter with satisfaction. If she couldn't have the Duke, she'd make sure his choice cost him dearly. The next morning, as Ilara's small trunk was loaded into the Duke's carriage, she had no idea that her first real challenge was already speeding toward the capital. She only knew that Cassian helped her into the carriage himself, sat beside her, and took her hand as they drove away from the only home she'd known. "Nervous?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "Good, so am I." She looked at him in surprise. "You're never nervous." "I'm nervous about everything that matters," Cassian said. "I've just learned to hide it well, but you don't have to hide with me, Ilara, not ever." As the carriage rolled toward Ashford Manor and the future, Ilara realized that for the first time in her life she wasn't invisible. She was seen. And somehow that was both wonderful and terrifying in equal measure. Ashford Manor was more beautiful than Ilara had imagined. The carriage rounded the final curve of the tree-lined drive, and there it stood, 3 stories of honey-coloured stone, with windows that caught the morning sun and transformed it into gold. Gardens stretched in every direction, wild roses climbing the walls, lavender swaying in the breeze. It looked like something from a dream. "Welcome home," Cassian said softly, watching her face. Home, the word felt foreign in her mouth. She'd never had a home, just places where she was tolerated. The staff was lined up to greet them. A butler named Mr. Pemberton, who'd been with the family for 30 years, Mrs. Cotsworth, the head housekeeper, and a dozen others whose names Ilara tried desperately to remember and immediately forgot. They were all staring at her. She was acutely aware of her simple dress, her worn travelling cloak, the small trunk that contained everything she owned. These people had probably expected their future duchess to arrive with carriages full of trunks, ladies' maids, and airs of nobility. Instead, they got a girl who looked like she should be cleaning their kitchens. "This is Ilara," Cassian said, and his voice carried a note of pride that made her heart squeeze. "She'll be the new Duchess of Ashford in 1 month. I expect you to assist her in every way possible as she adjusts to her new role." If anyone had objections, they were too well trained to show it. They bowed and curtsied and welcomed her with perfect professionalism. But Ilara caught the looks exchanged between some of the maids, the barely concealed surprise, the questions they were too polite to ask. Mrs. Cotsworth stepped forward, her expression kind but assessing. "Miss Ilara, I've prepared the rose suite for you. Shall I show you to your rooms?" "I'll show her," Cassian said. "But thank you, Mrs. Cotsworth. Could you arrange for tea in the garden in an hour?" "Of course, Your Grace." Ilara's rooms, and she had rooms plural, were overwhelming. A bedroom larger than the entire servants' quarters at the Harrington estate. A sitting room filled with books and comfortable chairs. A private bathroom with a tub deep enough to swim in. And everywhere, flowers, fresh roses in crystal vases, filling the air with perfume. "It's too much," Ilara whispered. "It's exactly enough," Cassian countered. "You deserve beauty, Ilara, get used to it." He showed her the wardrobe, already filled with dresses in soft colours. "I had these made in what I hope are your sizes. If they don't fit, we'll have them adjusted, and there are more being made." Ilara touched the fabric of the nearest gown, silk so fine it felt like water under her fingers. When did you? "I'm efficient when I'm motivated," Cassian said with a small smile. "There's someone I'd like you to meet, if you're not too tired." She wasn't tired, she was running on pure adrenaline and terror. He led her through the manor, down corridors lined with portraits of stern-looking ancestors, until they reached a bright room at the back of the house. A woman sat there, silver-haired and elegant, working on an embroidery frame. "Aunt Josephine," Cassian said warmly, "I'd like you to meet Ilara." The woman looked up, and her face transformed with a smile that reminded Ilara achingly of Cassian's rare genuine ones. "So this is the girl who's turned my nephew's world upside down." "I didn't mean to," Ilara blurted out, then flushed. "Of course you didn't. The best things in life are never meant." Josephine set aside her embroidery and stood, studying Ilara with sharp but kind eyes. "Cassian tells me you need help learning to navigate society." "I need help learning everything," Ilara admitted. "I don't know how to be a duchess. I barely know how to be a lady." "Good, then you won't have to unlearn bad habits." Josephine took Ilara's hands in her own. "I was born the daughter of a country vicar. I married into this family 50 years ago, and they all thought I'd fail spectacularly. Instead, I became the most respected hostess in 3 counties. Hope flickered in Ilara's chest. "How?" "By being myself, but with better posture and knowledge of which fork to use." Josephine winked. "The rest is just practice. We'll start tomorrow, for today just breathe." The garden tea was a small affair, just Cassian, Ilara and Aunt Josephine. They sat in dappled shade, surrounded by the kind of wild, beautiful garden Ilara had always dreamed of. "This could be yours," Cassian said, gesturing to a section that was currently overgrown. "To design however you wish." "Really?" Ilara's eyes lit up. "I could plant anything." "Anything, within reason. I'd prefer you not attempt carnivorous plants or anything that might eat the gardeners." It was the first joke she'd heard him make, and her laugh came out startled and genuine. They talked for hours. Aunt Josephine shared stories about the family, about Cassian's sister Margaret, about the manor's history. Cassian gradually relaxed, his formal demeanor melting into something warmer. For the first time, Ilara felt like this might actually be possible. That's when Mr. Pemberton appeared, carrying a silver tray with a single letter. "Your Grace, this just arrived from the capital. The messenger said it was urgent." Cassian's expression darkened as he read. When he looked up, his eyes had gone cold. "It seems word of our engagement has reached court," he said carefully. "The Queen requests my presence, immediately." "That's not a request," Aunt Josephine observed. "No, it's a summons." Cassian stood. "I'll need to leave tonight. I should be back in 3 days." "Should I come with you?" Ilara asked, though the thought terrified her. "No," his voice was firm. "You stay here, work with Aunt Josephine, and let me handle Her Majesty's displeasure." What he didn't say, what the letter had made painfully clear, was that the rumours Cordelia had spread had reached the Queen's ears. And Queen Charlotte was not pleased to hear that her nephew by marriage had gotten engaged to a nobody after what appeared to be a compromising midnight encounter. The next 3 days were the longest of Ilara's life. Aunt Josephine proved to be an exacting but patient teacher. They practiced walking with books balanced on Ilara's head. They reviewed forms of address until Ilara's mind spun with "Your Graces" and "Your Ladyships." They went through place settings until Ilara could identify every piece of silverware in her sleep. "You're doing remarkably well," Josephine said on the second day. "Most girls take weeks to master what you've learned in days." "I'm motivated," Ilara said. "I don't want to embarrass him." "Cassian chose you knowing exactly who you are," Josephine reminded her. "He's not expecting perfection, he's expecting honesty." But on the 3rd evening, when Cassian's carriage still hadn't returned, Ilara's confidence began to crack. She stood in the garden, her garden now, though she still couldn't quite believe it, as the sun set. She'd spent the afternoon planting her first roses, dirt under her fingernails, feeling more herself than she had in days. "He's not coming back," a voice said. Ilara spun to find Cordelia standing at the garden gate, travel-worn and smiling like a cat with cream. "How did you can't be here." "Can't I? This will be my sister's home soon enough. When the Duke realizes what a mistake he's made and offers for Beatrice instead." Ilara's heart was pounding. He won't. Won't he? The Queen is furious about the scandal. Did you know that? The whole court is laughing about the Duke who was trapped into marriage by a servant who compromised herself. Cordelia stepped closer. They're calling you calculating, manipulative, a gold digger who seduced a lonely man. That's not true, Ilara whispered. Truth doesn't matter, perception does, and right now the perception is that you're a fortune hunter who threw herself at a duke. Cordelia's eyes glittered. He's with the Queen now, being pressured to break the engagement, to choose someone suitable, and when he does you'll go back to being nobody, back to being invisible. Get out, Aunt Josephine's voice cut through the gathering darkness like a whip. She appeared from the manor, moving with surprising speed for a woman her age. Get off this property immediately, or I'll have you removed. Cordelia backed away, but her smile didn't fade. Ask him when he returns. Ask him if the Queen demanded he break it off. Ask him if he's strong enough to choose a nobody over his family's expectations. She disappeared into the twilight, leaving Ilara shaking. Don't listen to her, Josephine said firmly, putting an arm around Ilara's shoulders. Cassian is not that boy's father. He won't abandon you. But what if she's right? What if the pressure is too much? What if he realizes? What if you have a little faith, Josephine interrupted, in him and in yourself? But that night, alone in her beautiful rooms, Ilara couldn't sleep. She kept replaying Cordelia's words, kept imagining Cassian standing before the Queen, being told to choose duty over his heart. She imagined him realizing that marrying her would cost too much. She imagined going back to being invisible. By morning, she'd made a decision. She found Mr. Pemberton in the hall. I need a carriage, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I need to go to the capital. Miss Ilara, I don't think. Please, I need to see the Duke. Something in her desperation must have convinced him, because 20 minutes later, she was in a carriage headed toward the capital, and the confrontation she both dreaded and needed. She arrived at Cassian's townhouse in the city as the afternoon sun slanted through the streets. The butler looked surprised to see her, but let her in. The Duke is in his study, miss. He returned an hour ago. Shall I? I'll find him, Ilara said, already moving. She found him standing at the window, still in his formal court clothes, his shoulders tense. He turned as she entered, and the exhaustion on his face made her heart ache. Ilara, what are you doing here? Is something wrong? Is it true? She asked. Did the Queen order you to break our engagement? Cassian's expression shifted, surprise, then understanding, then anger. Cordelia came to see you. It doesn't matter how I know, just tell me, did she? Yes, Cassian said simply. The word hit like a physical blow. Ilara felt her knees weaken. But let me finish, Cassian continued, crossing the room to take her hands. The Queen demanded I break it off. She said I was making a fool of myself, that I'd be a laughingstock, that I was throwing away everything for her. He stopped, jaw tight. For a nobody, Ilara finished. She's right, I am nobody. I can't give you anything, no connections, no political advantages, nothing that a duchess should. Stop, Cassian said fiercely. You're doing exactly what they want you to do, talking yourself out of this because you've been told so many times you're not enough. But what if I'm not? What if I can't learn fast enough, or I embarrass you, or… Then we'll handle it together, Cassian interrupted. Do you know what I told the Queen? Ilara shook her head, not trusting her voice. I told her that my sister died because she married for duty instead of love. I told her that I'd rather be a laughingstock married to someone real than respected while married to someone perfect but false. And I told her that if she couldn't accept my choice, she'd have to find another nephew to manipulate. You said that to the Queen, Ilara breathed. I said considerably more than that, actually. Some of it I probably shouldn't repeat in polite company. His smile was wry. I may have burned several bridges. For me, Ilara whispered. For us, Cassian corrected. I'm not sacrificing myself on an altar of noble suffering. I'm choosing the life I want, and I want you in it. Ilara felt tears spilling over. I'm so scared. So am I, Cassian admitted. I'm terrified you'll wake up one day and realize you could have had an easier life, that you'll resent the pressure and the scrutiny and the constant judgment. I'm terrified I'll fail you, Ilara said. Then we're both terrified, we'll be terrified together. He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs wiping away her tears. But I'd rather be afraid with you than safe without you. The court will hate me. Some of them will, others will surprise you, and the ones who matter will see what I see, someone brave enough to take a chance on an impossible situation. What do you see? Ilara asked, needing to hear it. I see someone who survived years of being invisible and came out kind instead of bitter. I see someone who plants gardens because she believes in growth. I see someone who memorizes poetry and shares it like it's treasure. His voice softened. I see the person I want to spend my life knowing. Ilara kissed him then, her first real kiss, inexpert and desperate and perfect. He responded carefully at first, then deeper, pulling her close like she was something precious he might lose. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Marry me, Cassian said. Not in a month now, tomorrow. Let's not give anyone more time to tear this apart. Tomorrow, Ilara's eyes went wide. Tomorrow, I'll arrange everything. Small ceremony, just family and the people who matter. No grand society wedding where you're put on display for people to judge. His eyes were intense. Just us making promises we intend to keep. Yes, Ilara said, tomorrow, yes. The wedding took place in the private chapel at Ashford Manor, with late afternoon sun streaming through stained glass windows and turning everything golden. Ilara wore a simple white dress that Aunt Josephine had somehow produced overnight. Her hair was loose down her back, woven with flowers from her garden. She had no attendants, no grand entrance, no performance. She just walked down the short aisle to where Cassian waited, looking at her like she was every sunrise he'd ever hoped to see. The ceremony was brief, traditional vows spoken in voices that shook slightly, rings exchanged, matching bands of gold, and then the words that changed everything. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Cassian kissed her with the chapel full of witnesses, and Ilara felt something settle in her chest, something that felt like coming home. The small celebration afterward was held in the garden, Ilara's garden, wild and beautiful and full of possibility. Aunt Josephine had arranged everything with the help of the staff. There were perhaps 20 people there, Lord Thomas and his wife, a few of Cassian's closest friends, the senior servants who'd been with the family for decades. No Harringtons, Cassian had made sure of that. As the sun set and candles were lit throughout the garden, Ilara found herself standing apart for a moment, just watching her husband, laugh at something Thomas said, watching the way the staff no longer looked at her with doubt but with cautious acceptance, watching the way her garden transformed in candlelight into something magical. Having second thoughts, Aunt Josephine appeared at her elbow. No, Ilara said and realized it was true. I'm just taking it in. Yesterday I was nobody, today I'm a duchess. Yesterday you were yourself, today you're still yourself, just with a better address. Josephine squeezed her hand. The title doesn't change who you are, dear. It just gives you a platform to show people who you've always been. Over the next weeks, Ilara discovered Josephine was right. The court gossip didn't disappear. If anything, it intensified. Lady Sheffield wrote a particularly vicious piece about the kitchen maid who trapped a duke. Several ladies cut Ilara directly at her first public event. The whispers followed her everywhere. But something unexpected happened. For every person who scorned her, another stepped forward in support. A young countess who'd also married above her station, a scholar's daughter who'd faced similar judgment, even a few of the older nobility who remembered what it was like to marry for love instead of advantage. You're becoming something of a symbol, Thomas told her at a dinner party 6 weeks after the wedding. The girl who proved love matters more than lineage. I'm not trying to prove anything, Ilara protested. That's exactly why it's working, Thomas replied with a smile. The real test came 3 months into the marriage, at the Queen's annual garden party, the event that would formally introduce the new Duchess of Ashford to the full court. Ilara had been dreading it for weeks. You don't have to go, Cassian said the morning of the event, watching her pace their bedroom. We can send regrets. And confirm every rumor that I'm a coward who can't handle society. No, Ilara stopped pacing, straightening her shoulders. I can do this. I know you can, the question is whether you should have to. Your aunt married a vicar's daughter and won them over. Surely I can manage not to embarrass you for one afternoon. Cassian crossed the room and pulled her close. You could never embarrass me, but you might surprise them. Oh, she did. The Queen's garden party was everything Ilara had feared. Hundreds of the most powerful people in the kingdom, all dressed in their finest, all watching her with varying degrees of curiosity, skepticism, and outright hostility. Lady Sheffield was there, holding court near the rose arbor, clearly ready to catalogue every mistake the new Duchess made. Cordelia was there too. She'd managed to secure an invitation somehow, probably just to watch Ilara fail. But Ilara had spent 3 months learning, not just etiquette and protocol but strategy. Aunt Josephine had taught her that social events were battlefields, and the key to winning was knowing which battles to fight. She entered on Cassian's arm, wearing a gown of pale blue that Josephine had helped her choose, elegant but not ostentatious. Her hair was dressed simply, her jewelry was minimal. She looked exactly like what she was, a young woman slightly out of her depth but determined not to show it. The Queen received them in the main pavilion, her expression giving nothing away. Duke Ashford, she said coolly, and your bride. Your Majesty, Ilara said, executing the curtsy Josephine had made her practice 100 times. Thank you for your gracious invitation. The Queen studied her with sharp eyes. I understand you've been making quite an impression on certain segments of society. I'm trying to learn, Your Majesty. I'm grateful for the patience shown by those willing to teach me. And those not willing. Ilara met the Queen's gaze directly. I'm learning from them too. They teach me who I don't want to become. There was a long pause. Then, to everyone's shock, the Queen's lips twitched with something that might have been amusement. Bold words from a new Duchess. Honest words, Your Majesty. I was taught that honesty is the best policy. And who taught you that? My husband. Cassian squeezed her hand, and Ilara could feel his pride even without looking at him. The Queen dismissed them, and Ilara couldn't tell if she'd passed or failed the test. But as they circulated through the party, something shifted. The Queen's public acknowledgement, even a cool one, was permission for others to approach. Conversations started, questions were asked, and slowly the wall of hostility began to crack. Ilara talked about her garden with a botanist's wife, discussed poetry with a visiting scholar, listened intently to an elderly duchess's stories about the old days of the court. She didn't try to impress anyone, she just existed, honestly and openly. And it worked. By the time they departed, several ladies had promised to call on her. An invitation to a literary salon had been extended. Lord Thomas reported that he'd overheard multiple conversations praising the new Duchess's refreshing candour. In the carriage ride home, Cassian pulled her close. You were magnificent. I was terrified. You were magnificent and terrified. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Ilara laughed, feeling the tension drain from her shoulders. Did you see Cordelia's face when the Queen spoke to me? She looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. I was too busy watching you charm half the court without even trying. I still made mistakes, Ilara said. I used the wrong form of address with Lady Pemberton, and I'm fairly certain I committed a terrible faux pas with the refreshments. And yet here you are, still a duchess, still my wife, still yourself. 6 months later, in early spring, Ilara stood in her garden, now fully realized with roses and lavender, and those blue delphiniums she dreamed about. She wore a simple dress and had dirt under her fingernails from planting new bulbs. Cassian found her there, as he often did, and sat beside her on the bench she'd had installed. The Queen sent a letter, he said. Ilara tensed. Their relationship with the Queen had improved but was still delicate. She's hosting a spring gala. She specifically requested that we bring you, as she wants the visiting dignitaries to meet the Duchess everyone is talking about. Is that good or bad? Good, definitely good. Cassian handed her the letter. Read the postscript. Ilara scanned down to the Queen's personal note at the bottom. Your husband was right to choose honesty over performance. You've reminded this court that nobility is about character, not bloodline. Well done. Ilara looked up, tears prickling her eyes. She approves. She more than approves. You've won her over. Cassian pulled her close. You've won everyone over, even the people who were determined to hate you. Not everyone. Lady Sheffield still writes terrible things about me. Lady Sheffield writes terrible things about everyone. It's her sole purpose in life. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the birds and the rustle of roses in the wind. Are you happy? Cassian asked quietly. Ilara thought about the question, thought about the journey from invisible girl to Duchess, about the challenges and fears and moments of doubt, about learning to navigate a world she'd never been prepared for. About having someone beside her through all of it. Yes, she said simply, I'm happy, are you? More than I ever thought possible, Cassian replied. You've given me something I didn't even know I was missing. What's that? A real life, not a performance or a duty or a role to play, an actual life with someone who sees me. He kissed the top of her head. Thank you for being brave enough to say yes. Thank you for being brave enough to ask. A year to the day after their wedding, Ilara hosted her first major event at Ashford Manor, a garden party for the ladies of the court. She'd been planning it for months, designing it to be the kind of event she would have wanted to attend. Informal, focused on genuine conversation rather than performance, held in the beautiful gardens she'd created. Over 100 women came. They walked through the gardens, admiring the roses and lavender. They sat in small groups discussing books and ideas. They ate simple but elegant refreshments and laughed freely. And at the center of it all was Ilara, no longer the frightened girl who'd nearly dropped a tea tray, but a woman who'd learned to take up space without apology. Aunt Josephine found her near sunset, watching the guests from a quiet corner. You've done it, you know, Josephine said. Done what? Become exactly who you were always meant to be, not by changing yourself to fit their expectations, but by being yourself so completely that they had to adjust to you. Ilara smiled. You helped. I provided the tools, you did the work. Josephine hugged her. Margaret would have adored you. After the guests had departed and the sun had set, Cassian found Ilara in their private garden, the section she'd designed just for them, hidden from the rest of the manor by climbing roses. She'd built a small fountain there, and planted night-blooming jasmine that filled the air with sweetness. A successful party, he observed, settling beside her on the bench. I think so. Lady Sheffield even said something almost nice. Mark the calendar. That happens approximately once per decade. Ilara laughed and leaned against his shoulder. Do you ever regret it, choosing me over someone easier? Every day, Cassian said. She pulled back to look at him in shock and found him grinning. I regret, he continued, that I didn't meet you sooner, that we wasted years we could have spent together, that I almost chose duty and let you slip away. You're terrible, Ilara said, swatting his arm. I'm honest, you taught me that. He pulled her close again. I don't regret a single moment from the day you nearly dropped that tea tray. Well, maybe I regret not catching you more smoothly. I probably could have been more graceful about it. You were perfect. You were terrified. I still am sometimes, Ilara admitted. When I'm at court or meeting important people or facing situations I never trained for. And yet you do it anyway. That's called courage, love. They sat together as night fell completely, surrounded by the garden Ilara had created, a garden that had started as a dream shared with a stranger and grown into something real and beautiful. 3 years after the wedding, Ilara stood in the same private chapel where she'd married Cassian, holding their daughter as the priest blessed her. Rose Margaret Ashford, named for her garden and her aunt, had Cassian's dark hair and Ilara's eyes, and a personality that suggested she'd be a force to reckon with. The Queen attended the christening, which was itself remarkable. She stood as godmother, which was even more remarkable. "She's beautiful," the Queen said, peering at the baby with surprising tenderness. "Strong, like her mother." It was as close to a compliment as the Queen had ever given, and Ilara treasured it. That evening, as Ilara nursed Rose in the rocking chair by the window, Cassian stood watching them both. "What are you thinking?" Ilara asked. "That this is what my sister wanted for me. Not just marriage, but this, a family built on love instead of obligation, a life that's real." "Do you think she'd be proud?" "I think she's probably laughing at how dramatic the whole thing was, choosing the silent girl serving tea instead of the 3 eligible daughters." Cassian smiled. "Very theatrical even for me." "I wasn't completely silent," Ilara protested. "I answered questions. You were terrified and beautiful and honest, and you changed my entire life." Rose had fallen asleep, tiny fist curled against Ilara's chest. Cassian carefully took her, cradling their daughter with practiced ease, and carried her to the cradle. When he returned, he pulled Ilara to her feet and into his arms. "Dance with me," he said. "There's no music. We'll make our own." So they danced in the quiet room, swaying to a rhythm only they could hear, while their daughter slept and the stars came out over the gardens. And in that moment, Ilara thought about the girl she'd been, invisible, uncertain, convinced she was nobody. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. And she thought about the life she'd built with the man who'd seen her when everyone else looked through her. "Thank you," she whispered against Cassian's chest. "For what?" "For choosing me." "Thank you for letting yourself be chosen," Cassian replied, "and for choosing me back." Years later, when Rose was old enough to ask questions, she'd want to know the story of how her parents met. And Ilara would tell her about 3 sisters who stood before a duke, confident and prepared, and saying all the right things. And about a scared girl serving tea who nearly dropped the tray and ended up catching the duke's heart instead. She'd tell Rose that sometimes the most important moments in life come when you're least prepared for them. That being invisible doesn't mean being worthless. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing the terrifying thing anyway. And that the best love stories aren't about grand gestures or perfect people, but about 2 imperfect souls brave enough to choose each other and keep choosing each other, day after day, through challenges and triumphs and all the ordinary moments in between. In the garden that Ilara had dreamed of and built and filled with roses and lavender and blue delphiniums, her daughter would play among the flowers while Cassian read aloud from books of poetry, his voice carrying through the summer air. And Ilara would watch them both, her family, her home, her impossible, wonderful life, and remember the frightened girl who'd once believed she was nobody. And she'd smile, knowing that girl had been wrong. She'd always been somebody. She just needed someone to see it. And thank God he had.